Michel, pour ce discours fort intéressant. Puis maintenant, je vais continuer en anglais, ça c'est ma langue maternelle. But I did grow up here in Ottawa, and it's so wonderful to hear the French, because in Edmonton we don't hear it as much. You know, I got mic'd for moving around, but then I realized there's not that much space on the stage. So if I started moving around too much, I'd probably fall off, which would be really great for the live stream. So I'm just waiting for my PowerPoint to come up, or should I just advance? Is it going to be queued up? No? Let the technology gods take care of things. That's looking good. Fantastic. It's always nice to have people up in the sky taking care of your technology needs. So my name is Danielle Metcalfe-Chenail, and thank you so much to Canada's History Society for inviting me here today, and for making the weather so nice out, and getting me into the War Museum for the very first time. So I decided today I was really going to, oh, am I just not doing this right? There we go. Next. There we go. So I decided to, looking at the program for today, there were sort of three main questions, and that's what I decided I would form my talk around today. And I am an optimist, and I am seeing a lot of really great things. And when I see this question of, do Canadians still think about their history, my answer is an unequivocal yes. I live in Edmonton, and I'm the Historian Laureate there, which means I have the excuse to go out and hang out with people of all ages all the time to talk about local and national history. And what I see are, maybe even more than ever before, people looking at Canadian history. And I think part of this is because we, of course, have the large group of baby boomers, my parents involved in that group, and of course, you know, that is sort of the golden age for reflection usually. You have a little bit more time. I have a toddler, so I have no time to sit back and think. It's a good thing I'm paid to look into history, because otherwise I would probably be just trying to pay the mortgage, do my job, and try to stay sane with the, you know, Tasmanian devil of a 2.5-year-old running around. So, you know, the baby boomers are entering this golden age of reflection. You know, there are a lot of them, like my mom, for example, are involved in Ancestry.com, different genealogy groups around town, you know, hence the image of the family tree. And then local history societies, special interest groups, anything, you know, we mentioned Canadian Aviation Historical Society, so there's chapters across Canada. Those are people who are complete aviation nuts, like a lot of the folks in my family. And some of these groups are pretty traditional, and I have to say that they can be uncritical about history. You know, they're interested in their own family story, or the history of the mosquito bomber, like that one fellow earlier today. And so they're not necessarily aware of isms or historiography or some of those, you know, big fancy words that we had a little bingo card in my grad class. You could check something off of Foucault. You know, but it's still... It was, yeah, exactly. But you know what, they are so enthusiastic, and they are doing such incredibly important work to preserve that local history and their family histories. So this is great, this is good news. All right, so I mentioned the boomers, right? These are not my parents, I'm sad to say. I kind of wish they were. But you know, often I think in society, especially among younger people, they look at anyone over the age of 60 and they think, well, you have to be very conservative in your thinking. Well, of course, the baby boomers, they grew up during this era of social activism, right? The 60s and the 70s. And so they were really involved in protest and social justice activism, and they've carried that on. You know, of course, they had to pay their mortgages, they raised their kids, but they're still interested in equality, democracy, and human rights. And so they may be fueling gray power, but they are hip to authors talking about politics of power and anti-mainstream viewpoints. All right, so I mentioned that I'm Edmonton's Historian Laureate, and this was from one of the local papers. We have a great organization in Edmonton called the Edmonton Heritage Council, and last year they started doing these YEG Curiosities bus tours. So this is an artist rendition of one of those tours. And if you're not familiar with airport codes, YEG is the Edmonton airport code, and it is basically exploded. So it's #YEG for everything. So, you know, I got to be a tour guide on a couple of those buses, which fulfilled a lifelong dream of mine, because that's really what I wanted to do when I was in high school and university. And we go around different parts, and it really spoke to what Michelle was saying about enchantment. And so the enchantment, you get that kind of first hooks into things like the Ling'an Chinese restaurant that's been around since the 60s and has connections to Chinese market gardens, for example. Or the Civil Defense Edmonton, there's an old bunker, like the Defen bunker in Edmonton, that's still asbestos-ridden, but we have ideas for. Or the Silver Balls, which is a public art project that I know Calgary has their own stuff around art, but anyway. Of course you see the lady there with waving the rainbow flag. We did, one of the sections was animated by Michael Fair, who talked about Edmonton's gay history and queer history. So there's all these great ways to engage with the diversity of the stories. And so I have given talks to people of all ages, from Edmonton Lifelong Learners Association all the way down to the, we have a great thing called City Hall School, and so all the different schools, they actually send their students for 1 week to City Hall, and they learn about engagement as a good citizen. So the one there where it says being good, no, great citizens, that was from their citizenship fair last year, and like those young students we saw this morning, these are incredible leaders of tomorrow. And then down there, we have a lot of sort of these public expressions of history. And I'm being interviewed there by the Edmonton Journal's book review guy, who the City Hall School called my assistant, which I got a real kick out of. And really just bringing history to the people at every opportunity. And how can we talk about some of these stories in engaging ways? And so that little guy there, who's a little bush pilot, that is actually my son when he was 9 months old. And so I have a real vested interest in the next generation. I look at him, I want him to be excited about history, and not just history, but different stories. So, I skipped ahead. So, the next question was, is it possible to present a Pierre Berton-style national narrative in the 21st century with so many competing perspectives? And I don't think that it necessarily is a laudable goal, personally. I don't think that national narratives do reflect the diversity of our country. As I mentioned before, I think that should be one of our major interests. They, national narratives, or actually, I usually think of them more as nation-building narratives. They tend to be uncomplicated progressions towards, I think of this kind of upswell of sentimental music, where we learn a lesson and we're better off for it. Kind of like the after-school specials that I grew up. But you know what, I actually think that Life in History is more like Mad Men, which is one of my favorite shows. Nothing is tied up with a bow at the end. You're never exactly sure who to root for, and there's often a sense of unease. And like Sir John A. Macdonald, there's maybe a few drinks involved. So, as new voices have entered academic and public history, there is an unraveling of big nation-building narratives, and the ends of yarn, those mythologizing, blind patriotism, and discrimination, they were often already dangling there to begin with. So we love this guy, right? We're here because of him today. But it has been fashionable in academic circles to tear him down. And but I think we really owe him a great debt of gratitude, as Mark mentioned this morning, for making history unboring, Canadian history specifically. And he is unquestionably a fantastic storyteller. Or was, of course, before he passed away. But you know what, my mom actually had this exact copy of The National Dream. It was given to him, or to her, as a prize, actually, for a historical competition back in the 70s. And, as Mark mentioned this morning, it was created in, an afterglow of Expo 67. There was this kind of idea of a big nation-building project. But if you look at it, there are those strings already ready to be pulled. So it, while it was ahead of its time, or rather of its time, if you look at the inside flap of the dust jacket, we talked about publishing, of course. If you're a published author, you don't always get control over what happens with the cover copy. So I can't lay this firmly at Pierre Berton's feet, but if you look at the dust jacket, it says that the railway was built across empty country. And that inside that dust jacket, it talked about the nomadic and warlike Indian bands roaming there. So, yeah, as somebody who's done a lot of research around contact relations and actually, knows and interacts with a lot of Indigenous peoples, they would have some issue with that. There's nothing about treaties that I could find, but at least he does distinguish between Indigenous peoples. So there's the first string. Second string, barely a mention of Chinese railway workers, the head tax, or any other of those kind of dark sides of history that one young man talked about this morning in relation to his grandfather. So third string only uses printed documents in English. So of course you're going to get a very particular viewpoint. And it does say on the dust jacket that Canada was determined to do this, but of course he was really only reflecting the views of Anglophone politicians and businessmen. So as somebody who grew up in a bilingual and bicultural house, I can tell you that not everybody in the country was maybe on the same page. And of course, if you start talking about some of the other individuals involved, that is a bit of an oversimplification. So what can Canada's best storytellers do to tell Canada's history, and what can we do to help them? I don't know if a unifying national narrative is possible or even desirable, but I think it is important to look at big pictures because we can see those trends and patterns. And even though micro-histories are really fun and exciting, you have to read a lot of them in order to get that. In my university classes, we talked about the pointillism in art, that you can see this kind of broad picture if you stand back far enough and you read enough of those micro-histories, but that can take a long time, and we're all busy people. So, having those kind of broad narratives is important. And I'm definitely not putting myself in the same category as Pierre Burton, although maybe someday in 60 years when I've worked really, really hard, that would be fantastic. But in the case of my latest book, Polar Winds, I really did try to, obviously it's a century and it's Canada's north, so that's a long time span and a lot of territory to cover. And it was to be able to see some of those trends. But what I tried to do was mesh perspectives between Indigenous writers, oral histories and documents, newspaper accounts, and oral history projects from Old Crow, for example. So trying to mesh perspectives in hopefully a reasonably interesting way. Of course, another way to go about this is something like what Myrna Kostash did with the Frog Lake Reader, and she talks about that massacre side by side. She puts the documents there so that the reader brings their own critical eye to it. Now, I think what Pierre Burton and today's best storytellers, like Thomas King, have in common are a strong voice or a narrator. And even the third person omniscient, which is, usually what we write in history, has some teeth. And although someone like, Thomas King, he writes a lot of this in the first person, I think he does a really good job of that. Now, these aren't Canadian histories, but for me, these are two excellent examples of what interesting popular history can look like. These are two books I read in the last year, and it's funny how the highest praise for a historical book is that it reads like a novel, which is kind of funny. Maybe Mark can appreciate that one. But really, they incorporate dialogue, and what I loved about The Devil in the White City is you've got the dry architectural history, but it's interspersed with serial killers, right? And so you've got a whole lot of, I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads out there, yeah. And with The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, you are merging science and technology, culture, medical ethics, public health, and race relations. So I think these are great examples of how we can do this. And we talk about literary fiction, or nonfiction rather, and we talk about all these different sort of approaches, but one that we use a lot in the community is creative nonfiction. And I know that the creative in that can scare some people off. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're making anything up. It's that you're packaging it in a creative way, that you're dramatizing, you're putting in that dialogue, the climate, all those sort of juicy details that make the story come alive. But often, like Thomas King, you're putting in that first person too. You're acknowledging that your bias and what you're bringing to the table is just as important sometimes to the selection process as the historical record. So I think this is what some of the great storytellers will be doing in the future. And of course, there's my favorite lady in the whole country, Charlotte Gray, who I think is doing fantastic work with her biographies and histories. And then something like what Mark Abley's done here, where it's a conversation even. So people that are coming from different narrative traditions are really kind of shaking things up even now. But of course, Pierre Burton laid the groundwork for us. So I think the best storytellers, and these are just some examples, they know that popularizing something like Canadian history doesn't mean dumbing it down. And even in little kids that I talk to, their critical thinking is pretty intact. And, I think that when people are talking about and teaching historical consciousness, critical thinking, that is just as important sometimes as the facts and the figures and the dates. So they can go out there and be critical consumers of media. So many of these successful storytellers embody the big ideas of history too, like Charlotte Gray or Mark Abley. They attach them to living, breathing people. And I don't think it's an accident that a lot of these are journalists, Mark squared this morning. All the best ones are journalists. My mom went to Carleton for journalism, so I'm getting some good brownie points by saying that too. And so they also write in clear language. It's not purple prose or opaque text riddled with isms. It's casual language. It's different voices from the typical academic one, or even the sort of remote journalistic writing of the 5 W's. And I think we also, and we're going to hear about this later today, need to be more open to things like historical fiction or graphic novels. And that is a great way, especially to engage with young people. So finally, and Michelle already talked about this, the digital world. There's a lot of great technology out there that we can engage with, but again, it all comes down to story. So whether you're talking QR codes or passive embedded devices in monuments, or Holocaust survivor holograms, which I was reading about recently, or even enhanced ebooks and transmedia storytelling, I think what it really comes down to is those stories. And no matter what the medium, that's what the next generation of Canadian historians need to remember if they want to bring Canada's past to its present population. Thank you.